Have you ever stopped to reflect deeply on the weight that a promise can carry? Promises are often made impulsively, especially in moments of great distress or despair, when our mind is overwhelmed by circumstances and we are unable to fully measure the consequences. Now, imagine making a promise to God, the creator of the universe, in the midst of one of these critical moments, without thinking carefully about the impact that decision could have on the future. When the pressure of the moment lifts and the reality of the promise dawns, you realize that this choice, made in an instant of vulnerability, will shape and transform your life in ways you never could have predicted. This is the starting point of the reflection we will explore today. The story of Jephthah, one of Israel's judges, whose life and legacy were deeply marked by a singular promise he made to the Lord. The narrative of Jephthah is a story intertwined with fierce battles, unshakable faith, and a promise that led to unimaginable sacrifice. Jephthah, known for his courage and determination, made a solemn vow to God, swearing that, if he were victorious in a crucial battle, he would sacrifice as an offering to the Lord the first person who left his house to receive him. Little did he know that this person would be his own daughter, the only joy in his life. This story, therefore, is not only about the physical challenges faced in the wars of the time, but also about the internal and moral conflicts that Jephthah had to face when faced with fulfilling his promise. Today, we'll delve into the details of this biblical story, analyzing the nuances and dilemmas that Jephthah faced, from the difficult decision to accept his responsibility to the tragic outcome of his vow. More than a simple narrative of military courage, Jephthah's story is an invitation to reflect on the consequences of our actions and, especially, on the power and seriousness of the words we address to God. As we explore this journey, let's consider what lessons we can draw from Jephthah's life and how they can help us better understand the importance of our own promises and commitments, both in times of peace and in situations of crisis. I ask you to leave a like, and let's go to the video. In the time of the judges, life in Israel was like a merry-go-round full of ups and downs. Imagine a nation that constantly turned away from God, disobeying his laws and falling into disgrace. What happened? The enemies oppressed them, and the distress was such that, in despair, they cried out to the Lord for help. Every time they cried out, God, in his infinite mercy, raised up a judge to free them. It was a constant cycle: disobedience, oppression, outcry, and liberation. Then the Lord raised up judges who rescued them from the hands of those who dispossessed them. These leaders were instruments of divine will, bringing hope and renewal in dark times. However, after each deliverance, the ungrateful people quickly received the blessings and returned to their evil ways. With each new period of peace, prosperity seemed to intoxicate the hearts of the Israelites, who turned again to other gods. Thus, oppression returned like a storm after a brief calm. This vicious circle is a reflection of human nature, which easily forgets the miracles and kindnesses of God. However, every time they cried out in sincerity, the Lord heard and sent a Savior. The judges were not just warriors or political leaders, but true prophets of the covenant between God and Israel. Thus, the stage was set for the arrival of Jephthah, a man whose story is both inspiring and tragic. He would rise as a judge in times of great need, but his destiny would be marked by a fateful promise that would change his life forever. Jephthah's story begins in a context of challenges and difficulties that shaped his life and character. Jephthah was the son of Gilead, but his mother was a prostitute, which caused him to be rejected by his half-brothers, who expelled him from the house, saying, "You will not inherit in our father's house, because you are the son of another woman." Judges 11 verse 2. This family rejection caused him to seek refuge in Tob, where he joined a group of despicable men. This phase of Jephthah's life was marked by isolation and exclusion, but it also forged leadership and determination skills in him. When the Ammonites declared war on Israel, the elders of Gilead, desperate for a leader capable of meeting the threat, turned to Jephthah. They begged him to return and lead the army of Israel. Initially, Jephthah was suspicious of his intentions, remembering how he had been treated previously. However, the elders assured him that if he helped them defeat the Ammonites, he would be recognized as chief over all the inhabitants of Gilead. With this promise, Jephthah accepted, showing his sense of duty and desire for redemption. With his new position of leadership, he attempted to resolve the conflict peacefully, sending messengers to the king of the Ammonites to ask what the reason for the hostility was. The Ammonite king responded that Israel had taken his land when they left Egypt. However, this accusation was strongly contested by Jephthah, who used biblical history to refute the Ammonites' claims and justify Israelite possession of the lands in question. Jephthah responded with a detailed account of Israel's journey, as recorded in Numbers and Deuteronomy. He explained that, upon leaving Egypt, the Israelites asked for peaceful passage through the territories of Edom and Moab, but they were denied. When they arrived in the territory of the Amorites, led by Sihon, king of Heshbon, the situation was different. Israel requested peaceful passage through the Amorite territories, but Sihon not only denied it, but also attacked the Israelites. God delivered Sihon and his people into the hands of Israel, who then took possession of their lands, as recorded in Numbers 21:24-25. Jephthah used this argument to clarify that the lands originally belonged to the Amorites, not the Ammonites, and that the conquest was an act of defense, not aggression. Jephthah reinforced his argument by pointing out that during the 300 years that Israel occupied those lands, the Ammonites had never claimed possession until that time. He questioned the legitimacy of the Ammonites' claim, asking why they waited so long to assert their supposed rights. In Judges 11 verse 26, he said, "While Israel dwelt in Heshbon and its villages, in Aroer and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the Arnon River for 300 years, why did you not recover them at that time?" Furthermore, Jephthah emphasized that the Israelite conquest was sanctioned by God, the true owner of all lands. He declared that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given that land to his people, and that trying to take it away was against the divine will. Jephthah's message was clear. The lands did not belong to the Ammonites, and Israel was where God had destined. This point is crucial in Jephthah's defense, as, in addition to being a historical argument, it is also a theological argument, stating that Israel's right to the land was indisputable, as it was a divine concession. This explanation and his insistence on fighting demonstrate the depth of the dispute and the complexity of territorial relations at the time. Despite Jephthah's peaceful efforts, the king of the Ammonites did not heed his words, and war became inevitable. Realizing the gravity of the situation and the imminent threat, Jephthah turned to God in an act of desperation. He knew that victory could only be achieved with divine help. It was in this moment of intense pressure that he made his famous promise to God, swearing that, if he achieved victory over the Ammonites, he would sacrifice the first person who left his house upon his return. This promise reflected the urgency and seriousness of the challenge Jephthah faced. With divine confirmation, Jephthah gathered his army and prepared for battle. The war against the Ammonites was intense and brutal. Jephthah, a skilled strategist, used terrain and surprise to his advantage, guiding his men with courage and wisdom. The Lord was with Jephthah, and this divine help was crucial to Israel's victory. Jephthah and his army attacked in force, breaking through the enemy lines and defeating the Ammonites in several cities, from Aroer to Minnith and Abel-Cheramim. It was a decisive and complete victory, which brought relief and celebration to the people of Israel. During the battle, Jephthah's faith was continually tested, but he remained steadfast in his trust in God. Every movement on the battlefield was made with the awareness of the promise he had made to the Lord. The shadow of Jephthah's promise hung over him. He knew that when he returned home, he would have to face the consequences of his vote. Victory in the war was only the prelude to the sacrifice that was to come. Jephthah's fate was sealed, and his victory on the battlefield would be forever marked by the personal sacrifice he would have to make. His story teaches us about the seriousness of the promises made to God and the challenges that faith can face in times of crisis. Jephthah, the victorious warrior, returned home with a heavy heart, knowing that the promise made to God hung like a shadow over his victory. As he approached his home, the joy of victory was immediately eclipsed by the sight of his daughter, his only daughter, coming out to meet him with dancing and celebration. The scene, which should have been one of pure happiness, turned into a nightmare when Jephthah remembered the promise he had made. Upon seeing her, Jephthah tore his clothes in a gesture of deep lamentation and despair, exclaiming, "Ah, my daughter, you have brought me ruin. You are the cause of great pain to me, for I have made a vow to the Lord, and I cannot go back." Judges 11 verse 35. The pain in Jephthah's heart was palpable as his reckless promise now required the sacrifice of his own daughter. The tragedy of the situation was amplified by the innocence and joy of the young girl, who, unaware of the promise made by her father, just came to celebrate his return. When Jephthah revealed the promise, his daughter demonstrated calm, courageous acceptance. She responded with words of deep resignation. "Father, you made a vow to the Lord. Fulfill it with me." This response, full of courage and submission, reveals the depth of his faith and loyalty, not only to his father, but also to God. She understood the gravity of the situation and accepted her fate without protest. All he asked for was time to mourn his lost life. She asked Jephthah to allow her to spend 2 months in the mountains with her companions, to mourn her virginity, her life that would not be lived, the future she would never have. Jephthah granted her request, and so she left, knowing that her time was numbered. During these 2 months, the young woman and her friends wandered through the mountains, lamenting their fate. Each step along the trails was a painful farewell, a preparation for the upcoming sacrifice. At the end of this period, she returned to her father's house, ready to fulfill her destiny. Jephthah, deeply moved, knew he could not go back on his promise. The Bible tells us in Judges 11 verse 39, after 2 months, she returned to her father, who fulfilled his vow to her. This verse reflects the weight and resolution of the moment. The sacrifice, which seemed impossible, was carried out with unshakable faith. The story of Jephthah's daughter is a testimony of courage and submission to God's will. She accepted her fate with a dignity that transcends human understanding, becoming a figure of immense inspiration in the biblical narrative. His calm acceptance of the sacrifice is a powerful reminder of the promises and value of faith. In his final hours, the faith and strength of his spirit shone like a beacon, illuminating the darkness of his personal tragedy. The sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter also serves as a painful lesson in the recklessness of making promises in times of despair. Jephthah, in his distress, made a vow without considering the consequences, and this hasty decision led to the loss of his only daughter. However, the story also demonstrates how seriously God takes the vows made to him and the importance of honoring our words, even when the price is terribly high. The account of Jephthah and his daughter concludes with a deep reflection on faith, responsibility, and sacrifice. This impossible sacrifice not only freed Israel from the Ammonites, but also left an indelible mark on biblical history, reminding us of the strength and commitment needed to keep our promises to God. The story unfolds with an intensity that makes us reflect on the depth of faith and the weight of vows. Every moment, every step of Jephthah's daughter reminds us of the seriousness with which we must take our promises and the value of commitment before God. This biblical account continues to resonate as a lesson about responsibility and faith. Although the Bible does not provide explicit details about the death of Jephthah's daughter, the most common interpretation is that he literally fulfilled the vow he made by sacrificing his daughter. However, some interpretations suggest that the sacrifice may have been a vow of celibacy and lifelong dedication to God's service. According to this view, Jephthah would not have intended to perform a literal human sacrifice, but rather to dedicate the first person he encountered to the service of God, similar to what occurred with the Nazarites, such as Samuel. In this scenario, Jephthah's daughter, after returning from months of mourning in the mountains, would have dedicated herself to living a life of virginity and service to the Lord. This sacrifice, especially in a culture that valued marriage and offspring, would be considered significant. The phrase, "she never knew man," Judges 11 verse 39, is interpreted as confirmation that her sacrifice was, in fact, a life of chastity and service to God. This would also explain why the young women of Israel mourned Jephthah's daughter, annually celebrating her dedication and personal sacrifice. This interpretation, which suggests that Jephthah's daughter's sacrifice may have been one of celibacy and dedication to the service of God, offers a less brutal and more spiritually significant view. Instead of a literal death, this perspective proposes that Jephthah's daughter was consecrated to a life of chastity and devotion to the Lord, which, at that time, would have been considered an enormous sacrifice, especially in a culture that placed great importance on the Lord, marriage, and offspring. Such a commitment to remain a virgin, without ever forming a family, would have represented a complete renunciation of social life and the continuity of the family lineage, something of inestimable value in Israel. For Jephthah's daughter, this would mean living isolated from the pleasures and duties that society expected of a woman, making this type of sacrifice highly significant in a spiritual context. However, this view, although milder and perhaps more compatible with a symbolic and theological interpretation, faces serious challenges when confronted with the traditional interpretation that Jephthah actually offered his daughter in literal sacrifice. This literal view is largely supported by the cultural and historical context of the time in which the events occurred. Although the practice of human sacrifice was condemned by God in several passages of Scripture, it was still a known reality in other cultures around Israel. In that region, neighboring civilizations performed human sacrifices in their religious services, which may have influenced Jephthah's understanding of what God expected of him, even if it was wrong. Furthermore, Jephthah's own reaction to seeing his daughter leaving his home suggests deep shock and horror. When he tears his clothes in despair, it indicates that Jephthah knew, at that moment, that he had promised something much more severe than simply dedicating his daughter to a life of religious service or celibacy. His lament does not seem compatible with the idea of a promise that would result only in a life of devotion. Jephthah's despair reflects the gravity of his promise and the weight of his decision, as if he knew that what was at stake was his daughter's own life. This reinforces the idea that Jephthah's vow involved a literal and irreversible sacrifice. Furthermore, the biblical text's silence regarding an explicit condemnation of Jephthah's action also raises questions. Although human sacrifices were abominable in the eyes of God, the biblical narrative does not directly condemn Jephthah's act, which leaves room for different interpretations. This may indicate that, for writers of the time, fulfilling promises to God, no matter how terrible their consequences, was seen as an act of deep obedience and reverence. However, the absence of direct condemnation may also be a reflection of the moral complexity of the time and the tensions between surrounding cultural influences and divine law. In short, the interpretation that Jephthah's sacrifice was spiritual rather than literal in nature offers a less tragic and more theologically edifying alternative. However, this view faces significant obstacles, especially when we consider Jephthah's emotional reaction and the cultural context in which he lived, where human sacrifices, although contrary to God's will, were a present reality in neighboring nations. With these different interpretations, the story of Jephthah and his daughter continues to offer us a powerful lesson about the seriousness of promises made to God and the consequences that these words can bring. Whether we believe the sacrifice was literal or whether Jephthah's daughter dedicated her life to God's service, the weight of the promise remains the same. Both scenarios clearly and painfully illustrate the impact our words and commitments can have, especially when made in times of anguish or despair. The narrative challenges us to think deeply about the promises we make, whether big or small, and to consider whether we are truly willing to deal with the implications of our vows. Now that you know the story of Jephthah and the promise he made. It's time to reflect on what this means for our own lives. How many times, in moments of pressure, do we make promises without measuring the weight of our words? Are we really prepared to bear the consequences of the commitments we make, even when it could cost us something very valuable? The story of Jephthah teaches us that promises, especially those made before God, require a level of responsibility and integrity that we are often not accustomed to practicing. She reminds us that every word spoken must be taken seriously, and that true faith implies honoring our obligations, no matter how difficult they may be. This reflection leads us to question: are we ready to fulfill our vows, even when the price to pay is high? Modern life bombards us with situations in which promises are often made thoughtlessly, whether in our personal, professional, or spiritual relationships. However, Jephthah's story warns us about the importance of being responsible and conscientious when making commitments. Each vote must be a considered decision, and we must ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go to honor our words? The central lesson we can extract from Jephthah's story is that authentic faith is not only expressed in moments of victory or celebration, but mainly in moments when we are challenged to sacrifice something of great value to keep our word. This is a journey of responsibility, where integrity and character are put to the test. Jephthah's promise, although tragic, teaches us about the kind of commitment we should have with God and others. It calls us to live a life of greater integrity, where every promise is fulfilled with honesty, courage, and, above all, faith. I invite you to apply this reflection in your daily life. Take time to think about the promises and commitments you've made over time. Are you fulfilling them all? And most importantly, are you prepared to honor them, even if it requires personal sacrifices? May Jephthah's story be a constant reminder of the importance of being true to our words and commitments. Through this story, we can be inspired to cultivate a deeper faith, a more wholesome life, and a more serious commitment to our vows, both before God and before the people around us. If this content resonated with you and sparked a desire to learn more about the deep lessons of the Bible, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thus, you will continue to receive teachings and reflections on the most impactful stories in the Scriptures. Thank you very much for watching until the end. May God bless your life, and may this story inspire a personal transformation in your journey of faith and integrity. A big hug, and until the next meeting.